Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we speak with Norman Swan. The former GP turned journalist and ABC broadcaster established a reputation during the pandemic as Australia's resident health expert. But he joins us now following the release of a new book on parenthood. He chats to the podcast about parenting's do's and don'ts and what it's like covering health issues for the general public. And hosting this conversation about the life and work of this physician turned pundit is the editor of Good Weekend, Katrina Strickland.
Welcome, Norman.
Thanks, Katrina.
So you've done two books before. You've been a paediatrician and you...
Well, just to correct you on that, I trained as a paediatrician. I never went far enough to get my Australian qualifications. So I'm qualified in Britain, but not in Australia.
Not here. Okay. Well, you're a trained paediatrician and you've been a health reporter at the ABC since the early 1980s. In this new book that you've done, so you want to know what's good for your kids, you say it's one of the hardest tasks you've ever undertaken. And that's a lot of tasks you've undertaken that are quite hard. Why was this so hard?
Well, first of all, it was, I came to it with some arrogance thinking, well, I trained in paediatrics. I sit on the board of a not-for-profit which deals with well-being in children and youth. So I kind of thought, and I've been reporting on it, I kind of know this stuff. Well, in fact, I didn't know this stuff, and I really had to go back to basics in terms of the research. And the important thing about the book, well, it's for others to judge what's important, but from my point of view, this is about kids from 0 to 10 for parents. And the real gap, there's plenty of books around on early childhood. I still think there are gaps in early childhood, but the gap that is yawning in the marketplace for parents' information is the 5 to 10 year age group. And there's almost nothing out there, and there's very little research. So coming back to your original question, what was hard about it was researching those middle years. There's oodles and oodles of research on the early years, but to find good research on these middle years is tough.
And why is that? Like, what do you think is behind the fact that there's not a lot of research and not a lot of books out there?
I think that a lot of the issues that dominate thinking are about early childhood and early development, language, intellectual development, emotional development, sleep, all those sorts of things. And of course, it's a tense time, particularly for new parents. And there's no question that early childhood, the first 2 or 3 years of life, are incredibly important. So the one reason is a very heavy focus on that, and therefore there's only so many researchers to go around, and they haven't focused on the middle years. And the belief out there, which I think pervades researchers as well and teachers as well as parents, is that nothing much happens in those 5 years and you don't need to worry too much until you get to adolescence. And they've been neglected. Now, there's been growing realization of that over the last 5-10 years, and more research in this area, and more organizations realizing that they've got to focus on these middle years because they're incredibly important. So I'm trying to span the lot from early childhood through to age 10.
And one of the things that I was wondering if this was part of why it's been difficult is, do we have a lot more false news around health now than we did perhaps when you did your two previous books in this kind of series? Like, is there a lot more, I guess, falsity that parents are believing that you need to dispel, or is that not really the case?
I think in general, in the health and development area, there's a lot of stuff out there that's hard to sift through and work out what's real, what's true, what's factual, what's not. And I think that's as true from our previous books, one of which was more general health, one of which was about how to slow down aging, and this one. That it's true in all these areas. The difference with children and parenting is you're vulnerable. You know, you just don't have confidence, and you are always worried about, are you doing the best possible job? And there's always somebody out there to blame you. Everything is your fault.
Yeah.
And
You'll hear about it.
That's right. How do you avoid that? So I think that the emotional overlay is huge. And one of the things that, and again, just coming back to the two previous books as well as this one, the common theme through all three is treating the reader as an adult. I'm not giving you advice. I'm not telling you what to do. So there are books out there that will tell you what to do. I'm giving you the evidence. Here's what the evidence says. I've done the hard work for you to find out, what does the evidence say? I've let experts in the areas of the book look at it, read it, give me critique, tell me where I've gone wrong and so on, so I can correct that. So I'm confident in the evidence. And you make up your own mind. It's your child, you're the parent, you make up your own mind. At least I'm giving you the information, and I'm giving you the information in an easy to read, digestible format, and make up your own mind.
And you talk in the book about your own parents and I guess what you didn't like about your own parenting. Tell us a bit about your childhood and what you learnt from that.
It was different. First of all, it was a different world. I just don't have very many happy memories from my childhood. My mother was a very troubled force of nature and just not happy in herself, not happy in the marriage. Those were in the days where people stuck with their marriages. They didn't break up. They probably would have been better off had they done so. And there was just a lot of pressure and tension. And also my mother probably had what today would be called borderline personality trait, where you were never confident as a child in what her emotional state was, or whether she would suddenly turn on you. You would, and that was true till the day she died. You were never confident in how she was approaching you and whether or not it would be consistent. And she could turn on a sixpence and suddenly attack you, not physically, sometimes physically, but not. I wasn't physically abused, but just turn on a sixpence and attack you. And as a child, that's very unsettling, and you learn to distance yourself. So psychologists would say that I might have attachment problems, which I've worked on ever since.
Yeah, but it's interesting in the book, one of the areas which you talk about is warmth as a parenting style. And this is summarising, so tell me if I've got it wrong, but that need to self-regulate emotions so that your kids have that kind of certainty. Does that come from that kind of first-hand experience in part? Well,
the evidence is incontrovertible about the style of parenting that's best for your kids. So what kids need is consistency and predictability and routine. It's boring, but that's what they need. And in the style of parenting that works best. And by the way, one of the researchers that I tapped into for this book said, unless a book about parenting has that child's name on the cover, take it with a pinch of salt, because it's true. Every child is different. And so generalizing about parenting is quite hard. And what I talk a lot about in the book is how your child changes you. And you parent each child differently. But you can generalize to some extent, and it does go across cultures. So, routine, consistency, predictability, warmth, which is that you love your child, but that what goes along with love is setting boundaries. So your child, and that's part of predictability and routine, is your child knows what your limits are, and you set those limits, and you have expectations, which sounds very old-fashioned, but expectations work. And in the education sector, it's increasingly recognized that a teacher's expectations of their students makes a difference to their performance. So there's a tendency amongst parents to say, I'm going to create anxiety in my child by setting these expectations. It's quite the opposite. I talk a lot in the book about the spectrum of parenting and what's healthy and not. So it's called authoritative, not authoritarian, but authoritative parenting. Warm, confident boundaries. Now, what there's been a tendency towards, probably since time began, but particularly in recent history, is what you would call it sounds pejorative, indulgent parenting is that love is unconditional. Darling, anything goes. And I'm not going to, you're going to become your own person. I'm not going to set expectations. You're going to achieve, you're going to achieve what you're, I'm going to love, and I'm going to lavish love and attention on you in order to do that. That has poor outcomes, that indulgent parenting. So the two ends of the spectrum are neglectful parenting, harsh parenting, which has poor outcomes in terms of mental health, achievement in life, drug and alcohol use. And on the other end is indulgent parenting, where you don't set limits and boundaries. And the child of indulgent parents becomes an entitled child who never starts. They never achieve. They don't finish things. And so you want to find that happy balance in the middle, which with some kids can be hard to do.
And do we have too much indulgent parenting now? I mean, we always read stories about helicopter parenting and this kind of thing.
Helicopter parenting is different.
That's a different thing.
We'll come to that. It's important we come to that. But
in general, are we kind of in a slight epidemic of indulgent parenting at the moment, or not really? Should we not worry?
I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question. I suspect it peaked in the 70s with a kind of hippie generation. I've just been on vacation, and I went to the island of Idra in Greece, which is where Leonard Cohen spent many years, and Charmaine Cliff was there. And you had a generation of children on that island who were almost like a test bed for indulgent parenting. And if you read the books of that time, these kids did not do well in life. So I'm not sure that we are in a world of indulgent parenting. I think most parents do a great job, but you just got to be careful at the margins.
And then helicopter parenting, tell us about that.
Well, another style of parenting, it overlaps with overprotective parenting. So helicopter parenting kind of reaches its peak around about the age of 10, then into adolescence, where the parent wants to get involved in their child's life. And it takes various forms. So it wants to know everything the child's doing, wants to be involved in it, and in a sense wants to control it. Some kind of helicopter parenting sounds bad from the outside, but maybe okay. But when it's overprotective, it's not associated with good outcomes. It's associated with a higher instance of anxiety disorders, for example. And what happens here is, and if you go back to early childhood, is a child cries. Now, no parent likes to see their child crying. How do you respond to that crying? Well, it's different, obviously, when a child's in the first few months of life and they're hungry or they're tired, and there's fairly simple things going on. But as they become older, if your response, and it's particularly bad in parents who haven't dealt with their own anxiety, and also where you might have temperament involved, where the child might be a little bit reactive to their circumstances, where all you want to do is settle down the crying. So you want to solve the problem. So your attitude is, why are you crying? Okay, I fixed that. Let's move on. I'm oversimplifying here this conversation. As opposed to parenting which accepts that one of the trajectories you want your child on is where they have appropriate autonomy, where they can make decisions for themselves, appropriate to their age and development, where you're on a track to independence in adolescence, and you encourage them to problem solve. You don't solve their problems for them. You actually find a way to help them solve their problems. Now, that's not going to happen every time a child cries, but overprotective parenting tends to, the parent, for all the best intentions, wants to solve the problem of the child and solve it as quickly as possible so they stop crying. And that is a problem because the child doesn't learn autonomous behavior and problem solving as well as it could.
And one of the areas that I found interesting was around food, and you talk about, I guess, teaching kids self-regulation, which is kind of along similar lines, and also just some really useful advice like, don't use junk food as a reward. Tell us some of the things around food, because we are at a time when we've got, on the one hand, obesity, childhood obesity's growing, and on the other hand, so is anorexia, even under 10s, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. Eating disorders.
So we've got this very weird relationship with food these days. What's your advice to parents on food?
The first thing I say in the book is don't have food fights. Don't fight over food. You want your child to eat healthily. You've probably got to present a toddler with broccoli 20 times before they eat it.
And even then they don't like it.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, they kind of learn to eat it and they'll taste it and so on. And so they'll throw it off the high chair. So you just shrug your shoulders and they throw it off the high chair. You've got to be patient and persistent. And one of the problems that has occurred recently is that parents, and it's not new, is that with all this, so kids are picky eaters. Toddlers are picky. And the paradox that occurs is that they usually take solids really well up to 12 months. Then suddenly at 12 months, they start becoming picky eaters. Now, if you accede to that and only give them what they want,
Vegemite toast or something,
you can actually make the pickiness much worse. And you end up with a very picky eater by age 5. And that can actually become a disorder as well, not wanting to panic people about this. So what you've got to do is, if they're picky, shrug your shoulders, but keep on offering them the range of foods. Here's the thing about unhealthy food. If you are over anxious about unhealthy food, or you really want to stop them eating it, you can actually make the whole situation worse with unhealthy eating, with self-regulation where they don't learn regulation. So, for example, if they eat the broccoli, or you promise them a treat if they eat the broccoli, which is a chocolate biscuit or whatever, then unhealthy food takes on a special role in these children's lives. Kids are going to eat unhealthy food from time to time. They're going to go to a party and they're going to go to McDonald's. You're going to be in the car and they're going to want you to stop at McDonald's. Your child will not die of a heart attack if 3 or 4 times a year you stop at McDonald's or KFC on a long drive. Fighting over unhealthy food gives it a special place. So what researchers are realizing is if you are overly restrictive about unhealthy food, you actually increase the consumption of unhealthy food in your children, increase calorie consumption, and decrease their self-regulation of food. Now, the worst problem is if you buy unhealthy food, it's sitting there on the shelf, and your child knows it's there and they want it, then that creates a situation where the fight is almost inevitable. But if you don't buy unhealthy food, you're not making a fuss about it, but it's not in the house, then you don't create unnecessary fights. But if you're
you're not restricting the thing that they can see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You want to facilitate positive behavior without restriction and having fights. But if you're out and they want a treat, they're wanting to go and have some unhealthy food, don't make a big deal of it. Stop at McDonald's, let them have it, and move on. And you'll find that you've got a child who actually is not obsessed with unhealthy food.
One of the things that I found surprising was the whole don't let your kids sip alcohol under 10, like that we even need to say that. Is that a thing, is it, that that there's a certain view that, if they have little sips now and then between like 5 and 10, they'll be better with alcohol, or... What's the thinking that you're dispelling? The
notion is that I can train my child to be a sensible drinker.
Under 10?
Well, under 10, it happens, but also it happens over 10 in adolescence, where they can sit at the table and you're modeling the behavior and you're not getting drunk, and if they sip a little bit, what the heck? The problem with it is that you've still got a child. Now, maybe, first of all, are you a sensible drinker? We all have our own definition of what sensible drinking is. Secondly, you've got a child with a brain that's still evolving. And alcohol can change, any drug can change the way the brain develops. So what happens in the first 10 years of life, but it starts to change towards 8, 9, 10, is in the first few years of life, your brain overgrows. So it just grows topsy with all that development. And then the process of adolescence, which can start happening much sooner than you think, 8, 9, 10, is a pruning exercise, literally like pruning the roses in your garden. And your brain is pruned so that it gets molded in getting ready for adulthood, and there's not all this unnecessary brain tissue around causing short circuits and whatever it might do. Now, the pruning can go wrong if you add drugs to the mix.
So what age should you allow the odd sip?
Every parent will find as late as possible is the answer to that. But certainly the evidence, particularly, this is evidence gathered at Sydney University from some very large studies. Professor Marie Thiessen has done this work. These are thousands of children. Sipping is particularly bad under the age of 10. And you've got children who are sipping. Catholic kids are going to communion and maybe having some alcohol and so on. But the reality is, how regularly are you doing it, and the circumstances in which they are. So the answer is, you cannot train good alcohol consumption in children from the evidence. And the later your child starts drinking or using any drugs, the better.
One of the other areas that I thought was really interesting was screens. We all hear about how terrible screens are for kids, particularly, I guess, under 10s. Just to summarise, and then you can expand on that. I think you say basically no social media under 10, and
no social media under 13.
Under 13. And what you do as a parent, how obsessed you are with your phone, seems, from what I read, to be one of your biggest pieces of advice. Like, don't be obsessed with your phone. And is that a big part of it?
A constant theme through the book is they're always watching you. So kids are always watching you, no matter what you do. So if you overreact to situations and something fairly minor happens and you go overboard and get angry, not particularly at the child, but just in general, the child watches how you react and they think that overreacting to minor situations is normal, then you'll have a child who overreacts. And the same is true with screens. Research has shown that children's screen watching closely follows their parents. So if you're on your mobile phone all day, the child thinks that's normal and wonders why you're trying to exert discipline on their screen use when you're screen watching. So there's been some good research on that in the United Kingdom. What's at stake here is what's called the precautionary principle in public health, which is, if you think something's a risk and there's no harm in removing it, then remove it. I cannot find any evidence of harm in any of the literature of not giving a child a mobile phone before the age of 13, for example. I can't find any evidence of delaying screen use until later on in life. The hard thing is, of course, that schools use screens for educational purposes. But as one child development researcher, Professor Steve Zubrick, who I tapped into a lot for this book in terms of advice and guidance, said, do you really think, though, that giving a blank screen to a child is going to do them harm? Of course it's not. There's nothing terrible about a blank screen. It's what's on the screen that counts, and also what that does to your parenting, and also what it does to the child's experience of life. If the child is sitting on a screen by themselves and you're not interacting with them and engaging in the story, then you're losing parenting time. If the child's stuck in their room on a screen and they're not out playing with their friends, they're losing social connectedness. The other issue with so it's about content. And one of the problems with content, when you allow your child on, you think, well, I'm monitoring it, I've got protections on the device and so on, is that a lot of the content, even though it looks harmless, is episodic. So if you think of TikTok, there might just be a harmless thing of a child playing with an animal on TikTok. Well, what harm is that going to do? Rather than something toxic that's clearly toxic to a parent that you wouldn't want your child to watch, is that it's episodic in nature. So when you sit down and read a book to your child, there's a narrative. There's a beginning a middle, and an end. And remember, you're dealing with fragile, developing brains. And so in every story that you read, no matter how short, there's a narrative, and actions have consequences. So what would have happened if the little lamb hadn't bolted over there and done something else? And you have a conversation, and children start to realize that life is a narrative and actions have consequences. There's all sorts of things that children get out of stories. They don't get it out of a 15-second TikTok. And so they lose that sense of narrative.
And so can you at under 10 say, okay, so because I know parents say that it's fighting a losing battle to try and keep screens from teenagers, but are you more or less saying that under 10 you can, so you should?
You're the parent, they're the child.
What do you think?
Well, what I think is they should not get a mobile phone. Because once you've got a mobile phone, it's on for young and old, and you're going to have a constant fight. Now, if it's a tablet or a computer screen, well, there's not that much difference between that and a television screen, but you've got to be engaged in it. I mean, you and I grew up in the television era, and probably sat unmonitored watching all sorts of stuff on television. But this is a degree further. So sitting there with a tablet as the means by which you engage in stories and content, or you're there with the child and engaging in what they're watching, and that there are limits. You're not allowed this. There are times of the day where you're allowed this, and you're not going into your bedroom and being by yourself with it. Sorry, that's not going to happen. And it's part of that boundary setting. It's never been harder to be a parent than now. I'm very glad.
Do you believe that?
I do, because just think of all the influences on children that are so easy to acquire that were actually quite hard. If you watch television, you had 3-4 channels. That was it. You didn't have streaming. You didn't have thousands of options open to your child where they learn to work a device. And the other thing that happens, which goes to eating disorders and anxiety, both of which are almost certainly going up. Anxiety disorders probably going up in incidence. Eating disorders definitely going up. Is the thing that happens when, it was always possible, but it's called upward comparison, where you compare yourself to other people. There's always somebody who's more beautiful, more handsome, more muscular, thinner, better dressed than you, and you aspire to that. Screens through social media and also inadvertent access to that material makes that so much easier to acquire, where you're constantly comparing yourself to another and feeling dissatisfied about it. And
if adults struggle with that, how on earth can kids be expected to be equanimous,
Exactly.
Yeah.
We overestimate our children's cognitive capacity. So you might have a child who's incredibly articulate and converses with you, and you think that child has got great cognitive processing capacity. Well, they're still a 6 or 7-year-old, and they don't necessarily understand everything, and they aren't necessarily able to process it. So just because they talk like an adult doesn't mean their brain works like an adult, and they are still vulnerable.
So what was the most difficult part? Like when you look back on it, what is it that kept you awake at night and was the most difficult area to look at in terms of how we parent under 10s?
First of all, knowing what was worth talking about and what was worth not talking about, knowing what was real or not. So, for example, are we in the middle of an anxiety epidemic with children under 10? Are we in the middle of a depression epidemic of children under 10? The answer is no to depression, probably. But anxiety is worrying and probably is growing. And are we in an eating order? I've got a real problem with eating disorders under 10. And the answer is yes, unfortunately, with that. And Australia and New Zealand have high rates compared to other countries, and nobody understands why. It may just be that we diagnose it better. So those were areas where you really had, and a lot of the research is fresh here, where the eating disorder, there's lots of great eating disorder researchers around the world, but not enough of them. And so you're trying to tread through research and understand what what's worth paying attention to, what's good research and what's not. And that's where you've got to rely on people who really know what they're talking about, guiding you in that process. And I found the chapter on gender. I was quite honestly scared. This has become a war zone.
Yes, and your wording is very important, right? Were you nervous about how you actually say what you want to say?
Yeah, I was very respectful throughout the book. I am very respectful throughout the book, and I'd use there a lot rather than him or her as a generic term. And again, this is an area where the evidence is weak. I mean, it's much more. I mean, I'm glad I'm not writing a book on adolescence, where I think this becomes really fraught. But in the under 10s and the kids who are entering puberty, this whole idea of puberty blockers becomes very, very fraught. But the reality is it's a rare situation. The child who needs puberty blockers, it's incredibly rare.
At any age or under 10, you mean?
Well, it's really when it's defined by the child who needs puberty blockers and some people would argue strongly against what I'm about to say, but the evidence base is not strong here one way or the other. But the child who seems to benefit from puberty blockers is where really since day one, not quite day one, but where they've been able to identify themselves gender-wise, they've always identified with another gender. It's often boys. And it's just clear that this child, if allowed to go on, will need gender reassignment later on. It's rare. It's not a common situation. And if you can actually minimize their pubertal changes after puberty started, then it's going to be a much less traumatic procedure if they go to that, and it's reversible. And what they find is, and a lot of the good research comes out, a lot of quite interesting research has come out of Western Australia where they follow these children. A lot of these kids drop out of the clinics. Once the parents and the child goes through it, they realize it doesn't apply to them. And the kids who get to the end of the process and do need it, and it's an unusual situation, very few of them turn back. They continue on it. There's a much bigger issue, which is not part of the scope of this book, is girls going through puberty and into adolescence, where there's always been a bit of gender ambivalence since time began with gender identity and young women and girls. And the question is, do they actually need sex hormones to change their gender during those adolescent years? Or is it just part of normal growing up and it will sort itself out towards the end of adolescence and early adulthood? And that's a fraught area, but it's not part of this book, thankfully.
Thank God. And very fraught for parents to know what decision might be catastrophic.
Hugely so. And that's where social media comes in, is that they're convinced, kids are convinced that, well, this means, I'm not the gender I thought I was and I need to do something about it, rather than letting it flow and see what happens.
Coming back to your life, what do you think you as a parent did right and wrong? Like now reflecting, all your three kids are now adults.
Well,
what did you do really? What do you think you did really well, and what do you think now with hindsight you should have done differently, especially having done all the research, not just in under 10s, but as a health reporter for many decades?
I think that because I'd seen dysfunctional parenting personally, I worked, and I have to give credit to my children's mother. I was busy, I was at work, I was traveling a lot.
And she's a paediatrician as well.
She's a
right?
She's a proper paediatrician.
A real one.
Yeah, that's right. And she did the hard yards. And luckily we did not differ much in our approach towards, and she'd grown up in a very functional family and sort of family I kind of wished I'd grown up in. And I talk a little bit about that in the book. So having said that I don't think that I played as big a role as you might think. I was consistent, I think, with my children. They always knew where I was coming from. They always knew I loved them. I did set boundaries and expectations, and did their mum too. So my kids knew where they stood all the time, and they knew that whatever they were going to get out of life, they had to do for themselves. We'll provide the environment and the education and so on, but they had to go on. And and we've turned out 3 kids who are not entitled, don't feel entitled, who actually work hard. They're there at work before the other people get there, and they're still at work at the end. People often ask me about why Jonathan. I'm actually now better known as Jonathan Swan's father rather than
the New York Times writer who interviewed Trump in 2020, and it went viral.
Yes, and still reports on Trump. People, journalists particularly, say to him, "How did he make it?" Well, he's got talent, but lots of people have got talent. He's a hard worker, and he just puts in the hard yards and the hours. So I think they saw both their parents doing that. So I think we did that well. And what could I have done better? Being there. That's what every parent will tell you. Being there.
And can we escape the bad parenting that we've had? That's always a thing, isn't it?
There are times when I think I quote in the book. There was one I was writing part of the book just after I'd had a particularly frustrating day at the ABC, and I had. I don't have many tantrums, but I just lost it. I didn't lose it with any one person in particular. I just lost it and was expressing fury
Global
randomly
loss.
and audibly around me. And I suddenly drew myself up because I was listening to my mother. And I thought, got to stop that. So I think, you can't escape it completely. But if you understand it and have insight, then you're able to modify it.
And your daughter, Anna, we did at Good Weekend a story in 2020 on she had a horrific bike accident in Italy, which she got an acquired brain injury from. What have you learned by watching her? She's married, she's got 2 kids, she's a childcare worker. What have you learned, I guess, from her as a parent and watching her come out of that experience? I'm
in awe of my daughter, Anna. She's got resilience. She bounces back. She's never once said, "Why me?" And she's just worked and worked and worked at being as good as she can possibly be, which is pretty impressive. And she works in early childhood education. She's got herself a degree in that, and it's 8 years almost to the day from her accident, where she was in a coma in a hospital ICU in Italy, and she was in hospital for 7 months. It's just incredible to see, and that's her strength. I mean, her husband's strength too. He's supported her and worked hard with her, and people have gathered around. But what I've learned from that is the power of resilience.
And she had that all along, would you say?
Yes. Yeah. But you only really find it out when something really bad happens.
Final 2 questions. During COVID, you became both a household name, you probably already were, but more so, but you also got, in the firing line for people who didn't agree with what you were saying. How do you reflect on that? Because health reporters before that pandemic, I don't think got such scrutiny and such abuse, really.
What I learned out of that, which is, did I learn it? It just reinforced what I always did anyway, which is you got to call it as it is. The evidence is the evidence, and you present that, and you're respectful of difference and different opinions, but you're presenting the evidence. Now, you don't do that in an arrogant sense. You do it in a fairly straightforward way. And it's always difficult to deal with ideology when you're presenting the evidence. So you've got to be patient. And you do actually have to be resilient, because the media pylon, which happens from the same, I call them second-rate contrarians. There are people who populate part of the media who have made a name for themselves by just going against the grain. And they're second-raters. And they're the same people who are against climate change and it all comes from the same source. So you can't take it too seriously, but you also can't pretend it doesn't affect you emotionally. But so I had to stop my consumption of social media because it was just so toxic.
And I guess you just develop a thicker skin. Would you say you do have a thicker skin now?
I always had a pretty thick skin, not overreacting to things. I think a medical training does that for you, where if you are overreactive and you react to everything around you and you take it in, you don't survive terribly well in medicine. You have to learn. And it's bad on the other side where your skin's too thick, where you don't respond to people. But
in fact, that's what people often say about doctors, isn't it?
Yeah, and the training is part of the training is to toughen you up.
You've just got married for a third time.
Yes.
What's your biggest lesson on relationships? Just to finish off.
I think to understand yourself is really the important part, and to be really sensitive to others and to understand what's really of value in the person that you love and appreciate that.
Thank you, Norman. It's been a great chat. And
thanks for having me.
So You Want to Know What's Good for Your Kids is out now.
Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Subscriptions power our newsrooms. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Chi Wong. Editing from Conrad Marshall. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. And Katrina Strickland is the editor of Good Weekend.